Sometimes a good lawyer can find a way around an inconvenient law. Francis Gideon of Atlanta needed a good lawyer. The year was 1853. Gideon's large estate included land, stock, and slaves worth $70,000. He meant to divide his estate into thirds, one part going to his daughter, Louisiana, the second to the children of his sister, and the third to provide for the support of his 29 slaves, who would be freed upon his death. But Georgia law prohibited the manumission of slaves, and any will providing for such was void. In Georgia, it was all but impossible to free slaves. Gideon found a clever lawyer who crafted a well thought out, indirect means of accomplishing manumission by bequeathing his slaves to the American Colonization Society in Maryland for the purpose of sending them to Liberia in Africa. In Africa, they would be set free. The American Colonization Society supported the resettlement of freemen, those never enslaved, and freedmen, those freed from bondage, in Liberia. Between 1860 and 1852, more than 10,000 free and freedmen left America through the Society's efforts. They established a constitutional republic in Africa modeled on the government of the United States, with Monrovia its capital city. Many Southerners supported colonization, encouraging free blacks to leave Georgia. At the same time, the state passed laws prohibiting free persons of color from entering the state. The penalty for a violation was stiff, a $100 fine. Failure to pay the fine was unthinkable, for it meant being sold into slavery. Many Southerners opposed manumission because it provided hope to slaves and to abolitionists. The Georgia Supreme Court agreed, noting that efforts to diminish or end slavery triggered, quote, discontent and dissatisfaction in the mind of the otherwise happy and contented slave, and a restlessness for emancipation, close quote. Viewed in that light, Gideon's plan seemed dangerous, if not openly seditious, to his neighbors. The obvious candidate to help Gideon accomplish manumission was his son-in-law, lawyer Lucius Jeremiah Gartrell. He was a prominent Atlanta lawyer who had trained under the illustrious Robert Toombs. Gartrell was a rising star in Georgia politics. He was a leader in political and social thought and would soon win consecutive elections to serve in the United States House of Representatives. But Gartrell wasn't the right man to help Gideon. That was clear when he addressed the House in Washington on January 25, 1858. Speaking, quote, in the defense of slavery in the South, close quote, Gartrell gave an impassioned justification of his native region and its customs. He loathed manumission. He deemed colonization monstrous. He said, you can no more enslave the Anglo-Saxon race on this continent than you can make freemen of the Africans. And he believed that slavery has been written on the brow of the African. Francis Gideon didn't hide his feelings about his son-in-law. In bequeathing a life estate to his daughter, Louisiana, he gave her access to the interest earned on the inheritance. His executors were to pay that sum into her hand, but not into the hand of her husband. After her death, the balance would not go to Lucius Gartrell, but would instead be divided equally among the colored people and their descendants that Gideon sent to Liberia. In other words, Gideon meant for nothing to fall into Lucius Gartrell's hands. But a fiendish twist of fate waited. When Gideon died in 1853, his two executors declined to serve. In stepped Lucius Gartrell to fill their vacancy. Gartrell stood to benefit personally. If a court declared Gideon's manumission bequests void, the slaves and their funds would revert to the remaining lawful heirs. Louisiana Gartrell died shortly after her father, so Gartrell would inherit her share. An executor takes an oath to faithfully honor a will's provisions, but when Gartrell took the oath, he shrewdly omitted the provisions, quote, emancipating the slaves and giving them any portion of said estate, close quote. He deemed those bequests unlawful, void, and therefore non-binding. The American Colonization Society demanded that Gartrell surrender Gideon's slaves and their funds. Gartrell refused, so the society filed suit against him in Fulton County, seeking enforcement of the disputed provisions of Gideon's will. The judges and lawyers in the case were staunch advocates of Southern rights. They were men deeply involved in the widening schism between North and South, like Robert Toombs and Eugenius Nisbet. They and their allies were leaders asserting and defending Georgia's right as a sovereign state to determine its own political and social course. Men of their stature and determination were about to lead Georgia into war. Some of these very men would serve with distinction in the most terrible of battles, and others would pay a price beyond bearing. Southerners of such rank likely had little sympathy for Gideon's slave-freeing plans. The judge ruled in favor of Lucius Gartrell, finding that Francis Gideon's manumission provisions were void, so Gideon's 29 slaves wouldn't be freed and wouldn't go to Africa. Among these were Samuel, age 53 in 1853, Eve, age 48, and her children Charles, 22, Sarah Ann, 2, and Libertha Brown, 8, little Jane, age 21, and her daughter Savannah Cobb, 4, and the 5 children of James, America, age 15, Van Buren, 11, Georgia Ann, 9, Eliza, 8, and Thomas Hardin, 4. The Colonization Society appealed to the Georgia Supreme Court, where Chief Justice Joseph Henry Lumpkin, part of an influential family in Athens, wrote the opinion. He owned 18 slaves. Justice Lumpkin sprinkled his lengthy opinion with comments about the dangers which beset the institution of slavery. The citizens of Georgia, he declared, would not, quote, permit their rights to be assailed or their property to be rendered worthless, close quote. He said that those supporting manumission, quote, come among us under the cloak of a time-serving and hypocritical benevolence, close quote. He believed that schemes of colonization were vain and visionary, and the work of the Colonization Society useless. Quote, its professed objects never can be accomplished. They are wholly impracticable, close quote, he said. Lumpkin wandered deep into the realm of personal opinion in crafting his order. With respect to the Colonization Society, he confessed, quote, I was once in common with the great body of my fellow citizens of the South, the friend and patron of this enterprise, close quote. No longer. He now regarded it, quote, as a failure, if not something worse, as I do every effort that has been made for the abolition of Negro slavery, at home or abroad, close quote. Bearing no misgivings about the morality of slavery, Justice Lumpkin closed his tirade by tongue-lashing Southerners sympathetic to abolition. Quote, let our women and old men and persons of weak and infirm minds be disabused of the false and unfounded notion that slavery is sinful, and that they will peril their souls if they do not disinherit their offspring by emancipating their slaves, close quote. Nullifying a dying man's wishes to free his slaves and to keep his property from his son-in-law might seem unjust, but Judge Lumpkin's assessment of the legality of Gideon's bequests was correct. The American Colonization Society's charter specified that its mission was for the purpose of colonizing, with their own consent, in Africa, the free people of color residing in the United States, and for no other purpose whatsoever. Gideon's slaves weren't free, so by its own rules, the society couldn't send them to Africa. Because there was no other way to legally construe Gideon's will, Lumpkin ruled, his slaves had to remain slaves. They would pass to his heirs, almost certainly to Lucius Gartrell. Gartrell and his Southern compatriots surely celebrated his complete legal victory. Ironically, many American free persons of color did too. A convention of free blacks in Cincinnati in 1832 set forth their opposition to the Colonization Society's work. These Americans objected to, quote, leaving the land of our birth, close quote. They had no interest in going to a distant, unknown land, and any who chose to go were, quote, an enemy to humanity, religion, and justice, and a traitor to his brethren, close quote. Francis Gideon tried to navigate these shoal waters, but they proved too perilous for safe passage. State laws hostile to manumission and entrenched support in Georgia for slavery conspired to thwart his scheme. 8 more years would pass before America finally found a way to clear the channel of the myriad obstructions posed by slavery's complexities. To the sorrow of a nation, resolution required terrible civil war. Thank you for watching this Georgia Backroads program.